Welcome, good Erev Shabbos, Parshas Noach. This week we get to reacquaint ourselves with one of the most fascinating, interesting, enigmatic, and problematic parshios in the Torah, the story of Noach, the destruction of humanity, the punishment brought down by the Ribbono Shel Olam himself to the Dor HaMabul. Now, what was the sin of the Dor HaMabul? In fact, the sin, as is mentioned in the Pasuk and understood by Chazal, was Hamas. It was a violence perpetrated neighbor against neighbor, specifically around financial and material gain, thievery, theft, with a dash of violence. Not a very good society. Nevertheless, what is clear is that there were perpetrators and there were victims. There were people that were guilty and there were people that were innocent. And yet, HaKadosh Baruch Hu brings ruin upon all of humanity and does not distinguish, with Noach being an exception to the rule, does not distinguish between the perpetrator and the victim, between the guilty and the innocent. Everyone gets brushed with the same broad stroke. The Medrash deals with this question, and the Medrash says, while it is true that the perpetrators engaged in chimus de gezel, chimus mamon, in thievery and stealing and violence, the victims also perpetrated in something, and that is chimus devarim. What exactly is chimus devarim mean? What is that chimus devarim that the victims were thus included in the destruction of humanity? Rabbi Norman Lamb, in a Derasha he gave many years ago, cites the Alter of Slobodka, who says that chimus devarim means that the victims engaged in an overreaction, in a sanctimonious and self-righteous protestation. They were overly indignant, and thus, in doing so, brought ruin to society as a whole. If you steal $1 from me and I call for the death penalty, that's a problem in our society. If you steal $10 from me and I yell murder, that's a problem, because the call for accountability is not commensurate with the crime itself. The crime is there. The injustice is there. The problem is there. And it should be called out. And it should be mentioned. And it should be addressed. But not by an overly indignant, sanctimonious protestation full of self-righteousness and self-virtue. That's chimus devarim. And it's a more subtle sin and a more insidious one than chimus de mamon. Because when person A steals from person B, well, you can hold person A accountable, and everybody knows that stealing is wrong. We might do it, but we know that it's wrong. So it's an easier type of problem to solve, because nobody says that stealing is okay. But who's going to say that protesting injustice is wrong? There's an injustice and it's worth protesting. And it's worth calling out. And it's worth trying to change. And yet, chimus devarim is problematic. Because when the call for accountability is not commensurate with the crime itself, it is not only problematic because it is insidious to a civil society, but it's also problematic because it's insidious because the person themselves can't even recognize that they're engaged in it. Chimus devarim. During the time of the Mabul, the perpetrators were held accountable for committing the crime. The victims were held accountable for destroying society. We are in a red zone here in South Brooklyn. A red zone in which we are called, our shul has to gather in small groups of 10. People cannot gather properly. Businesses are closed down. Why? Why? The reason is, as we all know, because there are people that have acted without regard to the rules and regulations. And it's wrong. And it's wrong. It's also true that the current restrictions are overly broad. Collective punishment that punish the guilty and the innocent together, that take into account those who have flaunted the law and flaunted the regulations, and those who have done everything within their power to live healthfully and safely, and to safeguard themselves, safeguard their families, safeguard their neighbors, and safeguard their communities. Shuls have to be minimized, businesses have to be closed down, all types of restrictions. So is that fair? Is that indeed fair? Punish those who have, restrict those who require that type of regulation. Punish those who violate the law. And yet, while that is all true, the question is, how do we respond to that? And some of us, maybe some within our own community, point a finger at the authorities and call with a strong and clear voice anti-Semitism. These are anti-Semites that are engaged in these policies because they hate Jewish people. And I would just offer for consideration that before we walk down such a path, of extraordinary indignation against policies that indeed are impacting our lives, even the lives of those who are following the rules and regulations, before we walk down such a path, I think we have to ask ourselves and think long and hard, is this chimus devarim? Is this overly indignant protestation? Possibly. And if it is, we should be very careful, because chimus devarim is the prescription for our own self-destruction. I think that we have to pray that we have a little bit of wisdom. I think we need wisdom to be humble if we have acted wrongly, and the wisdom to properly protest if we have not. To properly protest if we have not. To fight chimus mamon wherever it exists, to fight injustice where it exists, but to fight it properly, to fight it wisely, and not be potentially an unwitting agent of our own destruction. Noach was an ish tzaddik v'tamim. He was tamim, he was whole and complete. He was a tzaddik, he was indeed righteous. But first and foremost, as Rav Gifter points out, he was an ish, he was a mensch. And it was on that basis that he ultimately was saved. He was saved. Where the rest of humanity went the way of, was banished to destruction. Where the rest of humanity was split into perpetrators and guiltless victims. The perpetrators being held accountable for their crimes, and the victims being held accountable for their overly indignant protestations, which corrupted and made a corrosive society. We have a choice. Do we want to be like Noach, or do we want to unwittingly and unintentionally follow the path of the Dor HaMabul? So what's the answer? I offer no answer today. But what I do challenge us to do is to think long and hard, very carefully, how we talk amongst ourselves, how we talk to our neighbors, what we say publicly, and who we condemn. If we think that it is in fact the case, then we should continue with that type of language and that type of protest. But if not, I think we need to dial it back. I think we need to dial it back significantly. Not only for the good of society, but for the good of our own community. May HaKadosh Baruch Hu give us the wisdom that we need in these difficult times. Good Shabbos.